Welcome to our video on addition and subtraction of fractions with like and unlike denominators. In this video, we're going to work with some really simple questions at the beginning and kind of build towards ones that are a little bit harder. Now, the first few examples that are down here at the bottom are fractions where we have a common denominator. If you have a common denominator, you're essentially going to combine like terms in the numerator and then look to reduce your fraction. Our first example is 3 over 5 minus 7 over 5. Again, I have a common denominator, so I'm going to take the numerators and I'm going to combine them. So I would take positive 3 subtract 7, that's negative 4, and then it's over 5. I would then look to reduce that fraction, but in this case I can't. Second example, again, we have two fractions that already have like denominators, so I'm going to take the numerators and put them together. It's going to be a plus b and then divided by c. In my last example on this slide, I have three fractions. Again, I look at all three denominators, they're the same, so I'm going to combine like terms in my numerators. I'm going to take 4a, add 7a, which is 11a. Take 11a, subtract 2a, which is 9a, and I'm going to divide that by 3b. As I said, once I combine them to become one fraction, I'm going to look to reduce. But take a good look, I'm going to notice that the numerator has a 9, the denominator has a 3. I can divide the top and bottom both by 3, reducing this fraction to become 3a on the top and then just a b on the bottom. Again, pretty simple examples. We'll go from there. Next example, we have a little more complex fractions in terms of their difficulty, but they're really not that bad. Again, if you look, we have a common denominator. We have an x minus 1 in both of our denominators. If we have a common denominator, we're going to combine like terms in our numerator and then reduce our fraction. Like terms, I see an x squared in the top with nothing else I can add to it. If I look next, I see that I have a positive 3x and a negative 3x. They're going to cancel each other out, and I'm left with a minus 1. And that's divided by, and in the bottom, it's an x minus 1. So I started by combining like terms in my numerator. Now I'm going to reduce. To reduce an algebraic fraction or rational expression, we're going to factor. The top is just the difference of perfect squares. Once we've done our factoring, we're going to look to reduce. I'm going to be able to cancel the x minus 1 that's in the top with the x minus 1 that's in the bottom, giving me an answer of x plus 1. My next example is pretty similar. The difference here is that there's subtraction. And there's one thing we have to be really careful of with subtraction, and that's to distribute this negative before we combine like terms. I'm going to take that negative and multiply it into both of those pieces. So I now see this as a to the second plus 3a minus 7a minus 5, and that whole thing is over my common denominator, which is 2a minus 10. Just like the last question, once I've done that distribution, I combine like terms. I have an a squared that has no like term. Then I see that I have a positive 3a and negative 7a, that becomes negative 4a, and then I have a minus 5. And my denominator for right now is 2a minus 10. Again, I've rewritten it as one fraction by doing my distribution, combining like terms. Now I'm going to look to reduce. To reduce, I factor the top. The top is going to become a minus 5 times a plus 1. The bottom has a greatest common factor of 2, and I have an a minus 5. Likewise, a minus 5 in the top is going to cancel with the a minus 5 in the bottom, leaving me an a plus 1 in the top and a 2 in the bottom. Now, we've looked at a couple of examples that have common denominators. Now we're going to start to look at some that don't. Our first step is to find a common denominator. Our common denominator is really the least common multiple for our denominators. I see that I have a denominator of 6 and a denominator of 2. Well, my common denominator, my least common multiple, is going to be 6. So if I have 6 as my common denominator, I'm going to have to make a few adjustments. My first fraction had a 6 as a denominator, so I don't have to change the top. But the second fraction had a 2. So I have to ask myself, well, what did I multiply that 2 by to turn it into a 6? Well, that obviously is 3. 2 times 3 is where my 6 came from. Whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top, making that a 9x. Once I've made that minor adjustment, I can now add my two fractions together to become 1. That'll be 14x over 6. Last thing I have to do is reduce. Just so happens that 2 goes into 14 and into 6. So if I divide the top by 2, I get 7x. Divide the bottom by 2, I get 3. So my final answer would be 7x plus 3. My next example, same basic idea here, but you're going to notice that I have three fractions. So I'm going to look at this as just one big question, and I'm going to go ahead and find a common denominator for all three denominators. I see a 4y, I see a y, and I see a 2y. Once again, my common denominator is the least common multiple, so it's going to have to be a 4y. So 4y is going to be my common denominator. Now I have to look to see if I made any changes. In my first fraction, I already had a 4y. Didn't change anything in the bottom. Don't change anything in the top. In my second fraction, I went from having a y to having a 4y. So I had to have multiplied the bottom by 4. If I multiply the bottom by 4, I have to multiply the top by 4. So that makes that 20. In my last fraction, I had a 2y as a denominator. Now I have 4y, so I multiplied that by 2. If I multiply the bottom by 2, I have to multiply the top by 2, and that's going to give me a 2 at the top. Once I've made all my adjustments to get my common denominator, I'm going to combine like terms. 3 plus 20 is 23. 23 minus 2 is going to be 21, and that's divided by 4y. Again, I'm going to look to see if I can reduce that. Look at the 21, look at the 4. I can't think of any numbers that go into both 21 and 4, so that's going to be the answer. Now, the next example we have, again, we've got two denominators that are different. Now, one denominator is 3, one denominator is 2. So our common denominator is going to be the least common multiple of those two numbers. The multiples of 3 would be 3, 6, 9, 12. Multiples of 2 would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. The least common multiple between those two is going to be 6. Again, this 3 became a 6 by multiplying by 2. If I multiply the bottom by 2, I have to multiply the top by 2. So that becomes 2x plus 10. The bottom was 2, it became a 6 by multiplying by 3. If I multiply the bottom by 3, I have to multiply the top by 3. And that makes that 6x minus 3. Once I have my common denominator, again, I'm going to combine like terms. When I combine like terms, it's 2x plus 6x, which is 8x. Then it's positive 10 minus 3, which is minus 7. And that whole thing is over 6. The last thing I would try to do would be to reduce my fraction. To reduce my fraction, I would look for a greatest common factor, look back to the top, and then reduce. But I don't see anything here that's going to reduce. So I would leave my answer as 8x plus 7. Next one, again, same idea, but it's getting a little more involved. We're going to notice if we look carefully that I have a monomial denominator and I have a binomial denominator. Now keep in mind that our common denominator is always just the least common multiple. If I see a monomial and a binomial, I'm just going to multiply those two things together to get my common denominator. So my common denominator is going to be a multiplied by a minus 5. Once I've identified my common denominator, same thought process, I'm going to look to see, all right, well, what did I do? I had an a over here, but now I have an a and an a minus 5. So I had to have multiplied the bottom by a minus 5. But whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. I have to multiply that top by a minus 5. Do that distribution, and that becomes 2a minus 10. Same thing in my second fraction. My second fraction, I had an a minus 5 already, but then all of a sudden my common denominator has an a in front. Well, if I multiply the bottom by a, I have to multiply the top by a, making that a 3a in the top. Once we have that common denominator, same place we've done before, we're going to combine like terms and then look to reduce. Combining like terms, 2a plus 3a is 5a. So I have 5a minus 10 in the top, and then in the bottom I have a and then an a minus 5. Last thing we're going to look to do is to reduce this. We're going to factor the top, take out that greatest common factor of 5. We're left with a minus 2. In the bottom we have an a and an a minus 5. Now, I'm always going to look to reduce. Sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. In this case, I cannot. Please remember, you have to cancel an entire binomial, not the little parts. So that would be my answer. Now, my next example, if you take a good look at it, it does get a little more involved. We, again, have binomial denominators, but these binomial denominators have pieces that need to be factored. If I can factor my denominator, that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start by taking that x squared minus 36 and making it x plus 6 and x minus 6. And I have my minus and the 1 on the top. And then with the x squared plus 6x, I take out a greatest common factor of x, and I'm left with x plus 6. Now, I've said it multiple times already, but my common denominator is just one of each of those pieces. It's the least common multiple. So my common denominator is going to have an x, it's going to have an x plus 6, and it's going to have an x minus 6. At this point, I need to decide what I did. My denominator that I have up here had x plus 6 times x minus 6, but the one that I have down here has an x out in front. So that means I multiply the bottom by x, and whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top, so this is now a 2x. Same thing here, this denominator started as x times x plus 6, but if I look here, it picked up an extra x minus 6. So if I multiplied the bottom by x minus 6, I have to multiply the top by x minus 6. Now, please be careful of that subtraction symbol that you see in the middle. That subtraction symbol, if you want to, you can connect it to that negative, that 1, making it a negative 1, and distribute it in. If you do that, just make sure you change that sign down here to a plus, making this a negative x and a positive x. That distributing negative 1 just changes signs. Now I'm going to combine like terms to make one fraction. If I take 2x, subtract x, that's x, plus 6 in the top. And then in the bottom, it's x times x plus 6 times x minus 6. Now, once again, I've done all my combining. I've changed my denominators, combine like terms. Now I'm going to reduce. In the top, the x plus 6 is going to cancel with the x plus 6 in the bottom. If everything cancels in the top, please remember to put a 1 as a placeholder. And our answer would be 1 over x multiplied by x minus 6. Now, we've got a couple more examples that we're going to see are pretty similar. This one here, again, I'm going to start by factoring my denominator. I'm going to go with 2, and this becomes x plus 2 times x minus 2. Minus, and then it's 1 over x times x plus 2. Now again, I'm trying to find my common denominator. My common denominator is going to be one of each of those pieces. So if I look carefully, I notice that I have to include an x, I have to include an x plus 2, and I have to include an x minus 2. So that's going to be my common denominator. Now again, I need to figure out what changes I made. This denominator picked up an x in the bottom, so if it picked up an x in the bottom, it has to pick up an x in the top, so that's going to be 2x. Right here, this denominator picked up an x minus 2, so if it picked up an x minus 2 in the bottom, it has to pick up an x minus 2 in the top. And just like we did before, I would connect that negative to that one that's in the top, changing that to a plus, and then I would distribute that in. That's going to be a negative x and a positive 2. Next thing we're going to do is combine those like terms and try to reduce. Combining like terms, I have 2x minus x, which is x, and then plus 2. And then at the bottom it's x plus 2, x minus 2. Just like we've done before, the x plus 2 and the x plus 2 are going to cancel. I'm left with a 1 in the top, and a final answer of 1 on the top, x and then x.